After that frightening-looking fire broke out in Deer Park, you might be wondering if there are chemical storage facilities in your neighborhood. But that could be tough because of Texas law. Let's connect the dots. In 2003, Texas passed the Homeland Security Act. It basically made government information that could potentially be used by terrorists confidential. Recently, companies have used that law to not reveal what chemicals they store at their facilities. One of the most famous cases was after that massive explosion in the town of West in 2013. A stockpile of ammonium nitrate at a fertilizer plant exploded, killing 15 people. When reporters started trying to find out if there were other stockpiles of that explosive material around the state, they were shut down by state officials, citing that law. A similar situation happened after the Arkema chemical plant explosions in the wake of Harvey. So while this new fire might spark new concerns about the chemicals next door, you and your neighbors may stay in the dark. Connecting the dots, I'm Marcelino Benito for H-Town Rush.